Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to talk about the city-states in ancient Greece. We're going to focus mainly on Athens and Sparta, and we're going to talk about some of the other political structures that different city-states had in ancient Greece, and we're going to build up our conversation about warring city-states because we're going to lead into the next lesson, which will talk about the Persian Wars. So make sure you're in your interactive notebook and you're following along. Okay, we're on page 3 of your interactive notebook. And again, we're talking about the warring city-states in ancient Greece. The warring part is going to come more in our next lesson, but we're just going to set the stage for that and talk about the importance of the city-states that developed in ancient Greece at this time. So our essential question for today: how did different city-states in Greece lead to different political systems? Because although we are in the same country, we have different city-states, obviously, and then some of them have completely different political structures, which is very interesting during this time period. Kind of think of it if the United States was broken up and Delaware had a different political structure than, say, Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York. Very odd in today's times, but back then it kind of worked because they were a little bit more divided. Again, think about that physical geography. There was mountains dividing them, so on and so forth. So city-states, what exactly is a city-state? By 750 BCE, the city-state model, or the polis, becomes the formal government model in ancient Greece. So again, the word polis means a city. It's a city-state, so it's the city and it's any surrounding villages, usually within a 50 to 500 square mile radius. That would be considered a city-state. The population of a city-state really was relatively small, about 10,000 citizens. So not huge. We're not talking like New York City, but it's a vast area. Citizens typically gathered in the marketplace. Pictured here is the old Acropolis of Athens. The marketplace was known as the Acropolis. And that was the typical gathering place of the typical citizen in ancient Greece in these city-states. So what are some of our different types of political structures? As we said, the city-states start to adopt different political structures. There were 4 main types of political structures that were adopted by these different groups. We had monarchies, aristocracies, knew I was going to mess that one up, aristocracies, we had oligarchies, and then we had direct democracy. So let's just kind of define real quick what each of these is. You might not have talked about these since probably 9th grade. So it's been a little bit of a while. So as a reminder, a monarchy is going to be a state. And when I say state, I don't mean like the state of Delaware. State is another term for a group or a city-state or a country, whatever. So it's the area that's ruled by a king, sometimes a queen. The rule is hereditary, meaning it's passed down through that family, typically down a male line, but sometimes to daughters. Some rulers did claim divine right. Think about how we talked about like the mandate of heaven with China. So sometimes that's happening here in ancient Greece, saying like, oh, I was chosen by God. And then it was practiced most notably by the Mycenaeans, starting in as early as 2000 BCE. Our aristocracy. This is a state that's ruled by nobility or wealthy elites. Rule again is hereditary, and again it's based on family ties, social rank, and or wealth. Social status and wealth supports, there we go, ruler's authority. So the more money you had, the more social status you had, more likely you're going to be the one that's in charge. This was most notably practiced in Athens prior to them adopting democracy, spoiler alert, and they practiced that as early as 594 BCE. Oligarchies are when we have a state that's ruled by a small group of citizens. Sometimes they can be wealthy elites, sometimes they can be military rulers. It just kind of depends on the situation. In our cases, our purposes here for ancient Greece, the rule is based on wealth or ability. So again, we could be a wealthy elite. The ability could be like military ability. The ruling group in an oligarchy does control the military, and the most common city-state in ancient Greece that's using an oligarchy was ancient Sparta, which we'll talk more about today. Finally, our direct democracy is going to seem the most familiar to us because this is what the United States and other modern democracies kind of modeled themselves after. We're not 100% perfect direct democracies. We're more of a representative democracy, but we have loose ties to these types of democracies. So this is when the state is ruled by its citizens. The rule is based on citizenship. So in order to have a vote, you need to be an active citizen. Majority rule is what's going to decide that vote. And then this is what's most notably practiced in ancient Athens as early as 500 BCE. The Athenians are kind of credited with creating modern democracy. And again, like I said, later democracies are what are going to be modeling themselves after. So let's talk about two of the most common, or the most not common, two of the most popular, there we go, city-states in ancient Greece. We have Athens and we have Sparta. They are two very different places to live in. And you're going to see that today in what we talk about, as well as any activities that you do with this lesson. So in ancient Athens, again, Athens is credited with being the birthplace of democracy. Between 500-ish into the 600s, this is when they say that they start adopting the principle of using a direct democracy. They develop a legal code that's based on the equality of citizens. I put citizens in quotations because a citizen in Athens was native born to the area and property owning and was a male. So females were not citizens, slaves, which they had, were not citizens. So when we say citizens, it's actually a very small part of the population. Again, property owning. So if you didn't own, if you're not very wealthy in Athens, you're also not a citizen. So it does neglect a lot of the people living in Athens, even though we say that it's ruled by the people. In Athens, they were very educational. A lot of our scholars and philosophers come out of Athens. Their logical thinking, young men, usually those who were wealthy, they send their sons off to school, and they go off and they learn to be good citizens. Basically, they learn a whole slew of different, math and poetry and logic and reason, all these different things, again, trying to make them a well-rounded citizen. When they do become older, they do enlist in the army or in the military. They go off because with the idea of trying to defend Athens, because we're going to see in our next lesson how we start to see some bashing of heads with Sparta. Girls, on the other hand, they were basically trained to do domestic duties. They learned from their mothers and or any other females in the household, grandmothers or aunts, whoever's living with them. And they're basically trained with the idea of how to become a good wife and how to become a good mother, how to raise a child, how to manage the household, all those different domestic type duties. So those are typical Athenian men and women roles. Sparta, on the other hand, Sparta was kind of its own little nugget. They decided to develop a military state. And a big thing is that they kind of contrasted with a lot of the different city-states because they were actually isolated. They were geographically isolated, and so they just kind of have a different outlook on life. They have different values, and one of the things that they valued was a strong military state. So that's what they decide to adopt. Instead of democracy, they're going to develop an oligarchy that has the military at the rule. So government, they actually had 4 branches of government, and the citizens are in charge of electing the officials. So it does have a little bit of a kind of taste of democracy, but it's not a true democracy. They did have 3 social classes. They had citizens, they had free non-citizens, and then helots or slaves. Your citizens are going to be people who were born in that, they're native born to that area. Free non-citizens are people that possibly came later and settled there. And then again, the slaves, they were a group that the Spartans had taken over and had enslaved. So finally, to talk about with Sparta, what's Spartan daily life like, if we kind of try and compare and contrast it to the ancient Athenians. Again, the Spartans valued duty, strength, honor, individuality, discipline over freedom. They were very Sparta had the most powerful army in Greece, kind of no-brainer. Males actually, they weren't focused on education, they were focused on their military. So they actually sent young boys at the age of 7 off to the army. You're 7 years old and you are put into the army. Can you imagine 7 years old? You stayed in the army and trained until you were 30 years old. So that's a hefty training period. And then you actually served in the army up until the age 60. So they were all about the army. That was what you were meant to do. They're not into philosophy and thinking and logic and reason. It's, we are Sparta, we are military. And so they are constantly on the defense. And we'll see later, as I said, we're going to go head to head with the Athenians. And sometimes Sparta's going to come out on top. Girls, they aren't necessarily training to become good wives and mothers in Sparta. They're very different than the Athenians. Girls are actually receiving some military training and they're living, not the typical little girl type life. They're living hardy lives. They're meant to protect themselves and they are taught from a very young age. Sparta is number one. We are to value and provide service to Sparta at all costs. We're not meant to be, cutesy little moms and play dolls and let's protect Sparta. So very interesting to see the contrast between two different city-states that are relatively in the same location. Again, there is some distance between the two and there is some isolation, but they're in the same country, but they're very, very different. So again, this was talking about the different city-states, our different political structures, and the differences between Athens and Sparta. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about the Persian Wars, and again, we'll see how the Athenians and the Spartans come head to head. So make sure you tune into that one. Thanks for watching.